As I've watched the insanity currently unraveling the United States and the impact that that is having across the Middle East and honestly across the entire planet, I was reflecting quite a bit on how on earth does a man like that get into political power, and how in practice are there next to no guardrails whatsoever to stop him from doing insane shit like what he's currently doing. And loving the Australian political system and looking at that, I have to say one of my personal reflections on that is that just looks like a terrible political system overall, and thank God this country is not a presidential democracy. Look, I've hated presidential style democracy for a while for a number of issues that I see with it. But I think looking specifically at the United States, I think that its political system, which we know, looking at the statements of the founders, was built with the intention of maintaining the separation of powers and ensuring accountability between all three branches of government. But in trying to do so, it's achieved neither of those goals. What Americans have at the moment is a political system where, in practice, the president can kind of do whatever he wants. And some people can say, oh, that's a bit hyperbolic. I don't think it is anymore, but it's not a new problem. The issue of presidential overreach and what authority Congress has to try and stop the president from going beyond what is considered acceptable has been a debate that's been raging since the time of Andrew Jackson in the United States. But the issue now is that in the modern world, so much authority has just been sort of brushed away by Congress over to the president. And now, in the modern age of modern warfare, the president can unilaterally decide to drag the United States into a war, so long as if it's longer than 60 days, he goes and gets permission from Congress. That is insanity. Could you imagine if Albo tried to do that? In some capacity here, if he tried to declare war on a country without anyone in Parliament, aside from himself, knowing about it, having no say whatsoever. He would have to go the ScoMo route, secretly appoint himself the defense minister, and that's only like the first issue that there is. And that I think that speaks volumes to Australia's political system. The last time a prime minister, and really kind of the only time the prime minister sidestepped Parliament entirely and gave himself ministerial positions, what happened? It became an enormous controversy, and he was officially censured by Parliament for it. I think this gap between political systems, between parliamentary and presidential systems, in terms of accountability and responsibility, was exemplified when, according to some reporting, when Trump was trying to convince Keir Starmer to get involved with him and provide some sort of support for the war in Iran, Starmer said to Trump, okay, I'm going to have to go back to my team and weigh this up before I agree to anything. Basically meaning go in and check in with his cabinet. And Trump, in response, was seemingly dumbfounded by the idea that a leader of a country would need to consult with other people in that country before agreeing to military action. I think Trump said something to the effect, allegedly, of, what are you talking about checking with other people? You're either in charge or you're not. I've thought this about Trump for a while, and I think the best way to describe his attitude on things like that, and why throughout both of his presidencies, he's been very dismissive of other opinions, even of people within his own political party. And I think that's because he primarily is a monster forged in the private sector, which in the United States and in most places around the world, the private sector is a fundamentally undemocratic place. The private sector, from business to business, is just one big set of autocracies. And Trump forged himself in that environment, not in a political one. It's why I think there's such a prevalent idea in America every time an election rolls around of, oh, we need a businessman. We need somebody who's worked in like the private sector to come and run the country and fix things up, thinking of the American political system like it's just one big company. And the executive branch is kind of run like that. You're, in all like real practice, completely independent from Congress. The worst they can do is impeach you and investigate you, but impeachment, realistically, is never going to happen in a current political environment in the United States. So you have someone thrown into a system who thinks in exclusively non-democratic ways and is running a system that is, whether by intent or not, kind of set up to run as if it is one man's marching band listening to his orders, and we wonder why problems come from that. You don't see that as much here in Australia, the idea that the Prime Minister should be a businessman, somebody from the private sector. I mean, the last time a creature truly of the private sector took the helm of this country, Malcolm Turnbull, he lasted about 15 minutes because he didn't know how to play politics properly. Of course, dozens of prime ministers have failed to play the political game despite being a part of it, but Turnbull was a unique example of somebody that came in, was very much, this is going to be my government, I'm going to run it my way, and that did not by any means pan out for him. Because if you want to be a prime minister in Australia, it is not about a personal degree of competence or thinking that you can be successful in your own right. It's about having the ability to negotiate with people and factions to get your agenda put forward. I think the simplest way to explain the difference between a prime minister and a president is that a prime minister is a much more powerful office. Kind of by definition of what it is, it's somebody that controls both the executive and to some extent the legislature, or at least one of the chambers in a legislature. So a very powerful position. But it's also one that has much less job security than most presidents do. In parliamentary systems, there are genuine calls every week for the Prime Minister to either step down or to have his party overthrow him. And that is something that overhangs every PM during their time in office. Just look back at the Rudd, Gillard, Rudd, Abbott, Turnbull, ScoMo years. It's not particularly difficult here, or really in any parliamentary system, to remove a Prime Minister from office or at least pressure them to step down. It is a very normal part of the political process that if a Prime Minister is failing demonstrably, that them stepping down or being kicked out is always on the table. That does not happen in presidential systems. I may be a little bit too general there. At least in the American system, there is no comparable pressure. The closest we've ever come to an actual impeachment was Nixon when he resigned, but it literally took probably the biggest political scandal post-World War II to get a president to admit, okay, the game is over, I have to go. The fact that in American history, it's not at all uncommon for a president to be beyond underwater in polling, to be despised in some instances, not only by the general public and the opposition, but by their own party, and then just be in a position where they say, you know what, I'm just going to sit out the next year and a half, 2 years, and we'll see what happens from there. That is not a recipe for success. This is a part of the reason why I found the 2024 presidential election, the lead up to it, not its results, but the whole process so funny as an outsider from a parliamentary system looking in, because the Americans were acting like it was the most dramatic thing in human history that Biden stepped down and that Harris took over as leader. There was an election in an election year where the leader didn't seem capable, so they swapped him out with somebody else. Here in Australia, there's a non-zero chance that's going to happen on both sides of the political spectrum in this year's Victorian election. The Liberals, in an election year, have already swapped out their leader, Brad Batten, for Jess Wilson, and there are now some rumblings in the Labor Party that they're going to swap the current Premier to try and get the poll numbers up there. It's just so crazy to think what in America is unprecedented and an insane situation to us is just another Tuesday.